Hello, dear listener. Welcome back to Historian Radio. I'm so glad you're here tonight. I hope wherever you are, whether tucked into bed, resting after a long day, or simply looking for a quiet moment, you've found a little space to breathe. Tonight, we continue our journey through the soft echoes of history. Not the loud parts, not the battles and banners, but the quieter truths that slip between the pages of time. In this episode, we step into the life of a woman whose name still lingers like perfume across centuries. A queen, a strategist, a mother, a symbol of both beauty and power. This is the full story of Cleopatra, just the myths, but the soul behind the legend. So close your eyes if you'd like, let your thoughts drift, and come with me now, back to the shores of the Nile, where a girl once watched the stars, and learned that the world could be ruled by silence, just as much as by swords. Chapter 1. Daughter of two worlds. She was born into a land of fading gods and foreign tongues. The year was 69 BC, and though the city of Alexandria sparkled with marble palaces and intellectual prestige, the sands beyond told a different story. A nation once divine, now ruled by outsiders. Her name was Cleopatra VII Philippa. She was born not to pharaohs of old, but to a dynasty of Greeks, descendants of Ptolemy I, the general of Alexander the Great, for nearly 3 centuries. Her family had ruled Egypt not as natives, but as foreign kings in golden temples, and yet, among her siblings, her rivals, and the shadows of her ancestors, Cleopatra would grow to become something they could never be. Egyptian not just in title, but in soul. From a young age, she watched, not with the indulgent distance of royalty, but with the focused silence of a survivor. Her world was complex. Her father, Ptolemy XII, Eliot, known mockingly as the flute player, was not a man of strength or vision. He ruled with Roman loans and trembling hands. His throne was a bargain, his crown a debt. Rome loomed over Egypt like the sun itself, warming and consuming all at once. Cleopatra learned early that power came not from lineage, but from language, so she studied 9 languages, some say perhaps more: Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, Aramaic, Median, Parthian, even Ethiopian dialects. She was the first of her dynasty in nearly 300 years to learn the native Egyptian tongue. While her brothers laughed at court games, she read Herodotus. While her sisters dressed for court, she listened to priests in the temples of Isis. She walked not just the halls of palaces, but the dust-choked alleys of markets, the stone floors of libraries, the sacred spaces where only silence could teach. Her mind was sharp, but it was her ears that made her powerful. She listened to the whispers of politics, to the murmurs of revolution, to the quiet desperation of a kingdom tired of being ruled by foreigners. She was still only a child when her father was exiled. The Roman Senate, in its endless hunger for influence, supported his enemies. For 3 years, Cleopatra watched the throne pass like a game of dice. When her father returned, it was with Roman gold and Roman promises. Egypt, once a land of gods, was now a debtor to the Republic. But Cleopatra she learned that power never travels alone. It comes with debt, with dependence, with danger, and most importantly, with choices. As her father grew older, weaker, more beholden to Rome, Cleopatra quietly stepped closer to the instruments of power. She studied grain distribution, sat with scribes during tax audits, attended religious ceremonies not as obligation, but as observation. She was rarely the loudest in the room, but always the one who remembered everything. And when her father finally died, when his body was laid beneath the marble coldness of Alexandria's tombs, he left behind a will. It named his two children, Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, as co-rulers. He was 10, she was 18, and the game had begun. She did not wear a crown of gold that day. She wore a braid of black, the symbol of Isis, and a gaze that neither smiled nor mourned. For Cleopatra understood, it is not the coronation that makes the queen, but the first night she sleeps with one eye open. Chapter 2. Blood on the throne. The throne of Egypt had never been kind. Even in its golden age, it had always been carved from suspicion. And now, in the age of Cleopatra, it was no longer a seat of gods, but a chair dragged through Roman dust, shared by two children of a crumbling dynasty. She was 18, he was 10, and though their names were paired on coins and decrees, their paths diverged from the moment they sat side by side. Cleopatra was queen, not just by blood, but by intention. She read with the scribes, advised with the priests, and attended the hearings of complaints from the common people. She stood on the balcony at midday, letting her face be seen in the sun, not as decoration, but as declaration. She did not hide. She ruled, and in doing so, she made enemies, not of her people, but of those who had always benefited from a voiceless crown. Ptolemy XIII was a boy, but he was not alone. Behind him stood a powerful regency, eunuchs, generals, and courtiers, who saw Cleopatra's independence not as strength, but as a threat. They whispered. Then they schemed. Within 2 years of their joint rule, Cleopatra was stripped of her name on royal edicts, her image removed from coins, her signature invalidated. She was not deposed in a ceremony, but erased in ink, and then she was exiled, driven from her palace. She crossed into the barren lands of Syria with little more than loyal servants, and the steel will of a woman who had already memorized the map of survival. Others might have broken, but Cleopatra gathered an army, not an empire's army, not Rome's steel, but a force of mercenaries, tribal allies, and the desperate, held together by a single idea: the queen still breathes. Meanwhile, in Alexandria, the boy king's court filled with the noise of parades and false power, but power without wisdom is a vase on a narrow ledge. And then came Rome, not as an ally, not as an enemy, but as a storm chasing its own thunder. Julius Caesar had come to Egypt, not for Cleopatra, not yet. He came seeking the ghost of Pompey, his great rival, the last breath of a civil war that had drowned Rome in blood. But Pompey had already met his end, murdered on Egyptian shores, beheaded by Ptolemy's advisors, offered to Caesar as a grotesque gift. It did not please him. Caesar, though a man of ambition, despised dishonor. He summoned the court. He summoned the boy king, and then, through couriers and coin, he summoned Cleopatra. Her arrival would become legend, not through trumpets, not through war, but through silence and silk, wrapped in cloth. Some said it was a rug, others a sail. Cleopatra was carried through the guards of Alexandria and unrolled at Caesar's feet. The moment was not loud, but it echoed through history. She stood before him not as a supplicant, but as a queen uninvited. She wore no crown, only her confidence, and Caesar, soldier of Rome, breaker of the Gauls, maker of victories, paused. He looked at her, and the game changed. The boy king, threatened by this rebirth of power, declared war on his own sister. Alexandria turned from marble to ash, The streets ran with fire as Caesar's troops clashed with Ptolemy's forces. The great library, the soul of the ancient world, caught flame. 1,000 scrolls curled into smoke. Knowledge gone with the wind, but the queen endured, and the boy, Ptolemy Zai, was found drowned in the Nile, his golden armor dragging him beneath the very river he was meant to rule. Cleopatra emerged not as survivor, but as victor. Not only had she reclaimed her throne, she had captured Rome's most powerful man. She would not just wear the double crown of Egypt, she would bear the child of Caesar, and history once again would find itself at her feet. Chapter 3. The rug and the general. The war was over. But silence rarely follows victory, especially when the world watches. The flames of Alexandria had barely cooled, its marble walls still echoing with the footsteps of soldiers and scribes, when Cleopatra and Caesar emerged, not as conquerors, but as something far more dangerous allies to the people of Egypt. Cleopatra was once again pharaoh, the sacred daughter of Isis, restored to her rightful place. To Caesar, she was a sovereign, queen, a political partner, a woman unlike any he had met. He lingered. Rome had called him back, but he stayed in Alexandria for months. They sailed together down the Nile, not in warships, but in a royal barge draped in gold and scented with lotus. The desert wind whispered through the reeds as the two rulers, one forged in the Forum, the other born of the Nile, dreamed aloud. Their journey was more than romantic. It was symbolic. By floating along the ancient waters of Egypt, Caesar declared to the world that Cleopatra was sovereign in her own right. Not a puppet, not a consort, but a ruler. She bore him a son, Ptolemy, the 15th Philopator Philometor Caesar, called Caesarion, Little Caesar. It was not a public announcement. Not yet. But the child became a living question. What would happen to the world if a Roman dictator left behind a pharaoh-born heir? The answer Rome was not ready to hear. Eventually, Caesar returned home, but Cleopatra followed. She arrived in Rome in 46 BC, not in exile or desperation, but as a queen in residence. She took up residence in Caesar's villa beyond the Tiber, not in secrecy, in quiet defiance. There she lived with her son. There she met senators, ambassadors, poets, and there the murmurs began. To many in the Senate, Cleopatra was not a queen. She was a threat, a foreign ruler, a symbol of monarchy, living under the protection of a man already accused of dreaming of kingship, for Caesar had begun to shift. He wore the purple robe of triumph, accepted endless honors. His face adorned coins unprecedented in the Republic, and he placed his statue among the gods in temples. Whispers became unrest. Rumors turned to rage. It was not just his title of dictator for life that terrified them. It was the idea that Cleopatra's son, part Roman, part pharaoh, might be his heir. Even Caesar's closest allies were unnerved. The Roman Republic, fragile and filled with pride, could not bear the weight of another crown. And then the Ides of March got. Cleopatra had seen omens before. She had learned the language of danger, but this she could not prevent. In the Senate house, Caesar fell beneath a storm of blades, not in war, but in ceremony. His body lay in silence. His will, once sealed, was opened, and inside, Cleopatra found a name missing. Caesarion was not named heir. Instead, Caesar had chosen a boy, his great-nephew, Gaius Octavius. Cleopatra said nothing. There were no protests, no demands. She gathered her son, left the Roman villa, and returned to Egypt, not as the mother of Rome's future, but as the ruler of her own past. Back in Alexandria, she mourned in solitude, not just for Caesar, but for the world that might have been. Her allies in Rome were either dead, in hiding, or becoming something else. The Senate, now fractured, declared her a political inconvenience. And yet, from the ashes of betrayal, Cleopatra remained queen. She turned her gaze inward, strengthened the economy, expanded trade, reaffirmed her role as living goddess. But she also waited, not for love, not for dreams, but for opportunity, and in time, Rome would offer her one more game to play, not with Caesar, but with the man who had once stood at Caesar's side in war, and now stood at the edge of empire, Mark Antony. But first, she would wait, as only queens know how to do, with patience, with silence, and with the quiet certainty that history always comes back around. Chapter 4. Queen reborn Alexandria glittered beneath the Mediterranean sun. Its harbour a bloom of sails and marble, its streets alive with scribes, merchants, and whispers. The queen had returned, but this Cleopatra was no longer the girl, exiled into desert winds. She was not the woman smuggled into Caesar's court. She was something sharper, stronger, shaped by death and crowned by silence. Caesar was gone, but Cleopatra remained. She wore her mourning not in black veils or broken tears, but in policy. She cut off unnecessary Roman trade routes, refused new loans to desperate senators, and fortified Egypt's borders with diplomacy rather than force. She held her court in golden stillness, not idle, but waiting at her side, growing taller by the season, was Caesarion. His face carried Caesar's brow, but his eyes were Egypt's, dark, wide, observing, though not named heir in Rome. In Alexandria he was already the son of a god. Statues depicted him as Horus reborn, the child god, rightful successor of divine power. Cleopatra had learned, the world respected, myth more than men, so she made a myth of her son. Temples were restored. Priests began prayers in Caesarion's name. Coins were minted, showing Cleopatra and her son side by side, mother and child, queen and king, mortal and divine. It was more than ceremony. It was message. Rome may have forgotten Caesar's child, but Egypt would not. Yet the world beyond Alexandria was stirring. Rome had descended into chaos once more. Caesar's murder had not saved the Republic. It had shattered it. His assassins, Brutus, Cassius, and their supporters, fled east, gathering armies trying to convince the world they had killed. Tyranny in response, Caesar's legacy formed. An unlikely trinity: Octavian, the teenage heir; Mark Antony, the general and longtime friend; and Lepidus, a placeholder in the shadows. Together, they created the Second Triumvirate, a legal, brutal alliance to cleanse Rome of dissent. Prescriptions followed, names were listed, heads were priced. Philosophers, senators, rivals cut down. Not with debate, but decree. Rome bled again. Cleopatra watched. She received letters, requests, demands. Antony wanted her allegiance, her wealth, her ship's dot. She declined, not because she feared him, but because timing is the sharpest blade in politics. And Cleopatra had learned to wait for the right moment to unsheath it. She remembered Antony, the man who once stood at Caesar's side, at the crossing of the Rubicon, the warrior who drank as much as he fought, laughed as much as he killed. But now he was no longer Caesar's echo. He was his own storm. After crushing Caesar's murderers of Philippi, Antony moved east toward the provinces, toward Egypt, toward her. And when he finally called for her, Cleopatra did not send apologies. She sent a stage. In the port city of Tarsus, where Antony waited on a plain wooden platform, Cleopatra arrived not in modesty, but in myth. Her ship was gilded. Its sails dyed purple, the color of royalty and ruin. Its oars stroked the water to the rhythm of music. She reclined beneath a canopy of gold, dressed as Isis, surrounded by attendants costumed as deities. Perfume wafted over the river, announcing her before her voice ever did. She did not walk to Antony. He came to her. Their meeting was not the spark of love that legends would claim. It was a collision of ambition, intellect, and need. Antony needed Egypt, its grain, its gold, its queen. Cleopatra needed Rome, its armies, its alliances, its future. Together they began to write a new chapter, one filled with nights of wine and laughter, yes, but also days of planning, of alliance, of children and cities, of coin and conquest. They became lovers. But more than that, they became partners. And in that union, Cleopatra rose once more, not as a pawn, not as a consort, but as a queen reborn, with a new Rome to reshape, and a new god to stand beside her. Chapter 5. Widow of the Rubicon. The stars above Alexandria shifted as the years turned. Rome was still Rome, hungry, growing, drowning in its own ambition, but Cleopatra had carved a space beyond its reach. For a moment, a very rare moment, she ruled in relative peace. With Mark Antony, she had found not safety, but symmetry. He was not Caesar. He was something else, less calculating, perhaps, but warmer. Less divine, but more devoted. He laughed louder, loved more freely, and unlike the men of the Senate, he did not fear her mind. Together they had 3 children: Alexander, Helios, the sun; Cleopatra, Selene, the moon; and Ptolemy, Philadelphus, a name heavy with dynastic memory. Her palace was once again full of voices, not whispers of betrayal, but footsteps of the future. And yet, Rome never stays quiet. While Cleopatra and Antony dreamed of unity, Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, was dreaming of something else: control. Octavian did not possess Antony's charisma, nor Caesar's presence, but he had something far more dangerous: patience and calculation. He built alliances, not through affection, but obligation. He ruled the Senate with quiet terror, using law as a weapon and image as armor. And when Antony remained in the East, too long, too close to Cleopatra, Octavian struck with his favorite blade: propaganda. He spoke to Rome not of policy, but of betrayal. Mark Antony no longer belongs to Rome, he said. He kneels before a foreign queen. He dines with her gods. He calls Alexandria his capital. Will you let Egypt rule us? The people listened. Because fear is easy to believe, Antony responded with gestures, not words. He gave lands to his children with Cleopatra, called Caesarion the true son of Caesara, direct threat to Octavian. He even sent a formal divorce to Octavia, Octavian's sister, whom he had married in a brief political detour. That was the final spark. Rome declared war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. Her face, once honored in coin, was now painted on enemy banners: a serpent, a siren, a sorceress. History has long debated what she truly was. But Cleopatra knew this much: no man in power fears a woman simply for being beautiful. They fear her when her mind matches her will. War was coming, and this time it would not be fought in alleys or courts. It would be decided on the open sea. She gathered her fleet, poured treasure into shipbuilding, armed the coastline, and prayed not to gods, but to the instincts that had saved her before. She was no longer the girl in the rug, no longer the widow in Rome, no longer the symbol. She was the sovereign of a dying world, standing at the edge of everything she had built. And though she had Antony beside her, though her children still ran through the echoing halls of her palace, Cleopatra began to feel it. The shape of an ending. It was not spoken aloud, but it hung in the air like incense. The gods had gone quiet, and Rome was roaring. Chapter 6. Actium. The sea was wide, endless, unforgiving, and on its blue mirror, two worlds sailed toward each other, one fading, one rising. On one side, Cleopatra and Mark Antony. On the other, Octavian, heir to Caesar, master of Rome's quiet vengeance. It was 31 BC. The Battle of Actium was not just a confrontation between ships, but between futures, one built on empire, one on legacy. And somewhere between oars and ambition lay the soul of the ancient world Antony had brought. Over 500 ships. Cleopatra, queen of tides and tact, had brought nearly 70 sleek, fast, rich with archers and gold. But Octavian had brought time. He stalled, he spread whispers, he bribed Antony's allies. His admiral, Agrippa, severed supply lines, took coastal cities, choked Antony's breath without ever drawing a blade. On the shores, soldiers grew hungry. Ships grew restless. Loyalty, as always, became fragile. And on the dawn of battle, winds low, sun climbing, the fate of Egypt sailed into history. Cleopatra waited at the edge of the fight, her ships positioned at the rear. She was not meant to lead, but to escape. If needed, the fighting began. Antony's galleys charged. Oars slammed. Arrows fell like rain. But the sea is cruel to men who doubt. And doubt had spread through Antony's fleet. Some ships fled, others stalled. Then, in the chaos, Cleopatra's fleet turned, not toward battle, but away. She had seen what Antony had not. The tide was lost. Octavian's grip had tightened. Like a net, some say she fled in fear. Others say it was strategy. All we know is this: Antony saw her sails vanish into the haze and followed. Abandoning command, he left his navy, his future, his men, for her. Together they sailed back to Egypt, leaving behind broken oars and betrayal. The battle was over. Rome had won. But Cleopatra and Antony still breathed. And that was a problem, because even in defeat they were dangerous. Together they were a symbol, and symbols live longer than swords. In Alexandria, Cleopatra did not collapse. She retreated into planning. She secured the treasury, strengthened city defenses, sent Caesarion east, away from Octavian's reach. She offered terms to Octavian: gold, grain, diplomatic illusions. But Octavian sent no messengers, only armies, by the end of the year. Roman banners hung on the Egyptian horizon. Alexandria, the city of scholars and stars, became a city of silence. Antony unraveled. He drank, he brooded. He walked the marble halls of the palace as though looking for a time machine. But Cleopatra planned. Her face remained serene, but her mind spun endlessly. She tested poisons on prisoners, measured doses, studied how to die. Just in case, because queens do not fall screaming. They choose their ending. And still, she hoped. Perhaps Octavian would listen. Perhaps Caesarion could be spared. Perhaps there was one more move. But the board was shrinking. And every day, the footsteps of Rome grew louder. Soon, there would be no more cards left to play. Only the moment to fold the game into silence. Chapter 7. The final room. The sun over Alexandria rose pale and thin, as if even the heavens hesitated to shine on what was to come. Rome had arrived. Octavian, quiet as frost, crossed into Egypt, not as a liberator, not as a conqueror, but as a man collecting the pieces of a fallen myth. The people did not cheer. They watched, tired, weary, that had seen too many banners change hands, too many gods fall. The queen remained within her palace, its tall columns draped in silence. She had not fled. She had not begged. But she had begun to withdraw, step by step, into the final room. Antony was broken. The general who once defied empires now wandered the palace gardens, eyes vacant, his hands trembling, not from age, but from knowing Cleopatra still shared the same palace with him, but they lived in separate griefs. She mourned the end of a nation. He mourned the end of himself. Then came the lie, a cruel whisper, whether born of intention or error, that Cleopatra was dead. Antony believed it, and in that moment, his heart, which no battle could pierce, split. He fell upon his own sword, not with ceremony, not with shouts of valor, but in a quiet chamber, surrounded by fading echoes. He did not die instantly. Instead, bleeding, staggering, he was carried to her, to Cleopatra. Their final reunion was not poetic. It was human. She wept. He reached for her, and, with his final breath, he gave her silence. No final words, only presence. Then he was gone. Now only she remained. The queen, the mother, the last light of Egypt. Octavian requested an audience. They met not in a throne room, but in mourning she appeared as she always had, dignified, composed, draped not in jewels, but in poise. She pleaded not for herself, but for Caesarion, her son. Octavian promised safety. He offered clemency. He smiled with the ease of a man who held all the keys and none of the mercy. Cleopatra knew the game. She had played it longer than he had been alive, and now she was choosing her final move. Back in her private chambers, she made preparations. Her attendants dressed her in the robes of Isis white, flowing, sacred. She adorned herself in gold and lapis, not as ornament, but as armor for the afterlife. On the floor lay scrolls, symbols, and a single basket. Some say inside was an asp, the sacred snake of the Nile, symbol of royalty, of death, of transcendence. Others believe it was a concoction, a poison known only to temple priests. The truth died with her. All we know is this: when Octavian's men entered the chamber, they found her still. Her two handmaidens, faithful to the end, lay lifeless beside her. Her expression was not of agony, it was of peace. As if, after all the storms, the queen had finally found the eye. Octavian looked upon her body. He ordered it preserved, buried with Antony, in a tomb she had long prepared. He found Caesarion, and despite his promises, the boy was executed. 2 Caesars is one too many, he is said to have whispered, and just like that, the bloodline of Cleopatra, of Alexander, of Isis, of the pharaohs was ended. But legends do not die with bodies. They live in echoes. And Cleopatra, though silenced by the sword, was reborn through memory, in paintings, in plays, in poems, whispered across time. To some, she is a seductress, to others, a victim, to many, a queen. But to the Nile, and to those who still dream of gold-tipped towers beneath the desert sun, she remains what she always was, the last sovereign of a sacred land, a woman who lived by intellect, loved by will, and chose the hour of her own departure. Chapter 8. The goddess disarmed, the tomb was sealed. Stone met stone in finality. Somewhere beneath Alexandria's shifting sands, beneath a city that no longer remembered how to speak her name without fear, lay Cleopatra, queen, mother, widow, myth, and yet the story did not end in that room. Rome, having claimed Egypt, did not merely annex land, it inherited legend. Octavian, now styled Augustus, became not just emperor of territory, but curator of narrative. And in that new Rome, proud, ordered, victorious, there was no place for a foreign queen who had made gods love her and men fear her, so they rewrote her. Gone was the scholar, the fluent diplomat who spoke 9 languages and negotiated grain deals as deftly as alliances. Gone was the philosopher queen who understood economy, religion, and statecraft with a mind sharper than any blade in her place. They left a seductress, a temptress, a woman of perfume and poison, not policy. Poets like Horace mocked her, Plutarch questioned her motives, and for centuries history would reduce her to a cautionary tale. Not because it was true, but because it was convenient. Powerful women, especially those who die on their own terms, have always frightened empires. But even within the lies, the truth lingers. Alexandria mourned her, not in open ritual, but in long silences at night, when the moon reflected over the harbor and sailors still whispered her name as though invoking protection. Temples, too, Isis stood longer than any Roman monument. In hidden chambers, Cleopatra's image remained carved in stone, a goddess with wings of order, a woman with eyes like prophecy, and though Rome erased her lineage, her children left shadows. Cleopatra, Selene, her daughter with Antony, was taken to Rome, paraded as a trophy. But she was no pawn. She grew, married a North African king, and ruled Mauritania as queen. Through her, Cleopatra's blood traveled south-east, beyond the reach of Rome. Meanwhile, Augustus, first emperor of a new age, founded his reign on control of territory, of language, of memory. He filled statues with his image, filled history books with his version of events. But Cleopatra could not be tamed. She drifted through time like incense, uncontained, unconfined, and in each generation she returned, sometimes in marble, sometimes in verse, sometimes in dreams, and always not as a victim, but as a mirror for power, for beauty, for defiance, for what it means to rise in a world that wants you to kneel. No one ever found her tomb. Perhaps that was her final trick, to leave Rome with her body, but never her soul, to make them wonder, to make them search, to make them remember. For even buried in silence, Cleopatra never truly left. She lingers in the Nile's hush, in the moonlight over broken columns, in the hearts of those who believe that power does not always come from armies, but from presence, and that legacy, that echo, is louder than any Roman trumpet. Chapter 9 echoes in marble long after her death. Long after her name faded from Roman decree, Cleopatra lived on, not in palaces, But in memory, she became a story, a myth, a canvas upon which every age would paint its desires, its warnings, its fantasies in imperial Rome. She was the foreign queen who dared challenge the Republic, the seductive enchantress who brought down not one great man but two poets. She was an exotic villain. Two politicians, a cautionary tale, two emperors, a ghost in the corridors, a reminder that even the greatest can fall for a woman they do not understand, but still, she endured, because stories, once loosed into the world, cannot be recalled. Centuries passed. In the dusty scrolls of Byzantine scribes, her name was preserved with unease. In Islamic histories, she was mentioned not for her beauty, but for her intellect, a ruler who built libraries, understood astronomy, and debated with philosophers. In the Renaissance, her image bloomed again, this time draped in mystery. A muse for painters, a queen who died not from weakness, but from choice. Artists like Guicciano, Gianandrea, Rixens, and Waterhouse captured her final moment, always poised, never broken. She became symbol and siren, subject and spirit. But who was she, truly? History offers fragments. A queen fluent in diplomacy, a strategist who played Rome at its own game. A lover, yes, but never only that. A woman who ruled when the world said she could not. She had wealth, but she used it with purpose. She had beauty, but wielded it with calculation. And above all, she had presence, the rare kind that bends rooms and bends fate in modern times. Cleopatra's image splinters into 1,000 forms. In the West, she is often painted white. In the East, dark and mysterious. Some see her as Egyptian, others as Greek, but she was always both, and more. She defied easy categories, because power, true power, rarely fits neatly into what history wants to write. She became Shakespeare's Cleopatra, full of passion, pride, and poetry. She became Hollywood's Cleopatra, lavish, adorned, and often misunderstood. And still, beneath every crown and every costume, a question lingers. What if we have never truly seen her? Maybe that is her greatest triumph, that no matter how many books are written, no matter how many films are made, the real Cleopatra remains just out of reach, a figure not frozen in time, but constantly moving through it. She is the smoke from the incense burner, the glint in the statue's eye, the quiet ripple on the Nile dot, and so long as someone speaks her name in awe or accusation, she lives. Chapter X. The last light of Egypt. The empire that consumed Egypt would outlast Cleopatra by centuries. It would fall and rise again in new names, new flags, carrying its legacies like old bones sewn into fresh skin. But what it never could contain, what no conquest, no poem, no propaganda could quite silence, was the light that lingered after her, not in torches, not in temples, but in memory. Cleopatra was the last pharaoh, not merely the final ruler of a dynasty, but the final breath of a civilization that had once built gods from stone and written time in stars. She did not go quietly, nor did she rage. She ended as she lived on her own terms. In the shadow of empire, she dared to choose her fate. Where others surrendered, she planned. Where others begged, she calculated. And in doing so, she gave her death the same weight as her life, an act of sovereignty. After her, Egypt was never the same. It became a province, not a kingdom. Its language faded, its rituals broken, its gods silenced. But something in the sand, in the wind off the Nile, still remembers. The lotus still blooms in quiet waters. The stars still shine where pyramids sleep. And in that hush, if you listen closely, you might still hear her name whispered, not shouted, not as a myth, not as a warning, but as a presence. Cleopatra's legacy is not about seduction. It is not about love affairs or politics. It is about resistance. It is about a woman who held the fate of an ancient world in her hands and refused to let it die quietly. She fought with words, with gold, with silence, with choice, and in the end, she became something even Rome could not touch. A symbol. Symbols do not fade. They evolve. From marble statues to silver screens, from papyrus scrolls to whispered lullabies, Cleopatra has traveled. Time not as history, but as legend. And now, as we close this story, let us not imagine her draped only in silk, surrounded by incense and song. Let us see her for what she was, a ruler, a mother, a strategist, a daughter of gods and of dust, the last light of Egypt, not extinguished, but carried forward, forever glowing in the minds of those who dare to lead when the world commands them to follow. Sleep now, dear listener. Let her memory drift beside you like the Nile beneath the moon, because the Queen has spoken and the night remembers.